Hey everybody, this is Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. Today we are going to have a wide-ranging discussion with my very good and lifelong friend Matthias von Hein, who is the European correspondent for Democracy Tomorrow. Matthias has a multi-decade storied career working for the German broadcaster Deutsche Welle, traveling far and wide across the world, carrying out interviews, writing in-depth articles, investigations, and so on. He's lived in China, he's lived in Taiwan, he lives currently in his home country of Germany, and has a lot to offer in terms of insights into what's going on in Europe today, past and future. So, first of all, Matthias, welcome to Democracy Tomorrow. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Right on. Well, tons of things are happening in Europe as always, and it's certainly not the region that it used to be, particularly in the post-war years, and things are evolving in many ways negatively. I noticed today that the new German government, headed by Merz, has decided to alter the rather flexible immigration and migration policies of his predecessor, or his first CDU predecessor, Angela Merkel, and made getting into Germany a lot more restrictive than it has been in recent years. What do you know about that?
Actually, he's trying to fulfill a campaign promise. We have to bear in mind that in the snap elections in February, which were called in after the breakup of the three-party so-called Ampel coalition, because Ampel, because of the colors, the red for the Socialist Democrats and yellow for the Liberals and green for the Green Party. It broke up. Actually, it's sort of around the same time, unfortunately, that Donald Trump was elected in the US. So since November, Germany sort of had no real government or government in waiting. And anyway, during his campaign, Friedrich Merz promised that, from day one, he would sort of shut the borders for migrants. And that was a nod sort of to, if you want, to those voters who might otherwise have probably voted for the far-right alternative for Germany, AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, it's called. And AfD, has come out very, very strong in this election. It has been the second strongest party, with almost close to 30% of the vote. So imagine almost every third voter, made his cross at the far right AfD, which, by the way, the internal intelligence service just labeled as surely right extreme. Anyway, so part of what drove voters to vote for the far right, for the AfD, was, and what the far right has been utilizing in their campaign, was discontent with the migration policy of Angela Merkel that you mentioned, who was famously sort of opened the border and claimed, we can do this, we can cope with really, I don't know, we had like more than 1 million migrants that very year, 2015. And problems showed up, and problems were not really addressed with migrants. And I think the established parties missed the opportunity to really honestly address problems that came with the migrants. There were some problems. It wasn't just all smooth sailing. So the far right managed to profit a lot from that, and Friedrich Merz, the now newly elected chancellor, we'll come to that process in a minute. Friedrich Merz, he, as I said, promised on the campaign trail that he will tackle, that, strongly and resolutely from day one. And his interior minister, Dobrindt, Alexander Dobrindt, from the Christian Democratic sister party that's only running in Bavaria, which is the southern German state, the Christian Socialist Union, which is even more conservative than the Christian Democrats. He followed suit on day one, really. And not, I don't know how much we want to go into the details here, but he didn't order the border police to stop migrants, but he gave them more leeway to do that if they wanted so, which is a political maneuver, because also Friedrich Merz, he, on his very first day in office, he went to France, to Paris, to meet with Emmanuel Macron, but he also went to Poland to meet with the Polish government. And the Polish government under Donald Tusk, they are facing elections too. And they are also under pressure from their far right. And the last thing they want is, being pressured by their far right opponents that their German friends are making life more difficult for the Poles because they send migrants back to Poland. So the German interior minister kind of, he tried to find a way through this ear of the needle by, not really ordering a full stop of migrants, but giving the border police more leeway. Right. And so in a way, this fits very well into the whole, this kind of zigzag start fits, I think, well into the whole start of the Friedrich Merz government, because for the very first time since the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany, a chancellor was not elected in the first round of voting. It took 2 rounds of voting, which in many countries this wouldn't be such a big deal. But in Germany, it was almost regarded as just a bureaucratic procedure to have the chancellor elected, once the coalition contract is signed and all, and you have your majority, they have a majority of 18 seats.
Right. So who were the ones, who do you think, I mean, it's a secret vote, of course, but who do you think withheld their votes for their leader in the first round?
I have no idea. I mean, this is pure speculation. Probably, there are people on both sides meaning, the coalition partners of the Christian Democrats, the Christian Socialists on the one side, and the Social Democrats on the other. I think, there are, if you look at the lineup of the people who got government posts, who were promoted to ministers and who weren't, there is some discontent there, especially on the side of the Social Democrats. Especially among the Social Democrats, there is still some discontent with Friedrich Merz, because without real political need, he pushed through a vote in the German parliament earlier this year, together with the Alternative for Deutschland, which had no real effect, but which was a sign kind of that, which could be interpreted that he would be willing to work with the AfD, if need be, in the eyes of Friedrich Merz. So there's a lot of discontent there. And then again, there might be some more discontent also on the side of the Christian Democrats, because some of the delegates might feel that that Friedrich Merz gave away too much to the Social Democrats. And, we've just talked about the border situation and the migrants. and you know, the desire sort of from Friedrich Merz and his party to fulfill a campaign promise, but they already broke another campaign promise, and that is, you know, the sort of German, the constitutional debt break. You know, Germany had, you know, and it was in the constitution, you know, it was really enshrined in law that the government had a limit on deficit spending, on borrowing money. And, you know, this was really the holy grail, especially for conservatives. And Friedrich Merz wasn't even elected chancellor when he managed to overthrow this debt break, partly also to satisfy the Social Democrats, because, you know, they lobbied very strongly and effectively for major infrastructural investment to the tune of 500 billion euros, but also to be able to invest heavily in the military, also to the tune of more than 500 billion euros. So that's for German standards, and the Germans are, you know, are very much on the conservative side here. That was a major thing, and especially for conservatives. So there is some discontent there, even from conservative side with their conservative chancellor.
Right.
So, you know, all in all, there are lots of reasons for discontent, and, you know, lots of reasons from various sides to, you know, show a kind of red card. And so we really don't know. It's really up for speculation, and it was a secret vote. And even in the second round of vote, not, you know, he hasn't got the full spectrum of votes, but he went through. You know, now he's sailing, and you know, just a couple of words here on, you know, the lineup and what's to be expected. This is a conservative government now, even with, you know, of course, the Social Democrats are an important part, but as we have seen, you know, in regard to border and what the Interior Minister is doing, so I think we are in for a conservative rollback. Also, cultural wise, we have a new culture minister, Wolfram Weimert, his name. He's a publisher of a sort of rather right-oriented political magazine. It's called Cicero. He's a polemicist by trade. He's sort of architect of a conservative renaissance. He in 2018 he wrote a conservative manifesto, you know, and Christian identity, politics, biological essentialism. You know, he's very much against wokeness and multiculturalism. He promotes very conservative ideas of family and gender roles. So I think, you know, I think we're in for for a kind of culture. I wouldn't say culture war, but, you know, there's some cultural wise, there's some rollback in the coming up. His foreign minister, Wadefuhl, he's also, I would regard him as a NATO hawk. He was duped in earlier this year by two Russian satirists who claimed to be Ukrainian journalists, and, you know, who you know, sort of made him, you know, talk sort of off the cuff, and he said, you know, no matter, you know, in regard to Russia, and he said, you know, of course, you know, if he could, he would have delivered, you know, long-range missiles that would be able to strike Russia deep inside. And he also said, no matter how this war, the current war in Ukraine will end, Russia will always be the enemy. So that's our chief diplomat. Another thing is that is not, maybe doesn't really fit into the right left scheme of things, but I think it's also telling that just a day after the election results in February were in, and it was clear that Friedrich Merz would be chancellor, he announced his plan to invite Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, despite the active arrest warrant of the International Criminal Court. So, I mean, that openly defies international law. It totally undermines the pretense of global accountability. And more to the present or to the near future, in the coming week, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, he is going to Israel on a state visit and is meeting Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, actually on May 13th, and all this against the backdrop, against the ongoing Israeli offensive in Gaza, which some would say is an operation for ethnic cleansing, which actually Israeli politicians openly sort of promote.
So how do they justify that? I mean, Germany has traditionally been one of the strongest supporters of the International Criminal Court. They've, of course, ratified all of the major human rights treaties and Convention Against Genocide and all of the others. And obviously, because of the history of what occurred in that country, there's, great sensitivity to all matters regarding Israel. But I think a lot of the world is rather surprised at how close and supportive the government of Germany is of the government of Israel, even in the best of times, let alone right now in the worst of times. I mean, it's really surprising to a lot of people how close they are to each other.
There's surprising little discussion in Germany about that. There's surprisingly little discussion about Israel and Gaza and Palestine, and especially, there's lots of support even in the media. Sometimes I won't say it doesn't come up at all, and sometimes we have like international lawyers on talk shows who say, this is a total no-go. We cannot do this. We cannot ignore that. And then, but the standard argument, as you say, as you already hinted at, is that Germany has a special sort of responsibility to the state of Israel, to the safety of the state of Israel. It's already even called Staatsräson, sort of, it's really in the strongest terms. It's not written in the law though, but
well, it's probably
comes up all the time. So Germany side, kind of German politicians, at least, they say they feel responsible for the safety of the state of Israel, and that justifies all this support. And they don't really, and they say, yes, of course, we are concerned about what's going on in Gaza. We are concerned that there's no food coming in for more than 2 months. We are concerned about the plant, but there's no action following. And I think it's, in my eyes, it is totally the wrong lessons from the never again, after the fall of the Nazis and the Holocaust. It shouldn't be just that atrocities or genocide against one people, in this case like Jews, should be opposed, but atrocities and genocide against any people. Talking about the end of the Nazis, there's another major thing happening this week, and that's the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II.
Absolutely.
And interestingly enough, in my eyes, I mean, in years past, better years, I would like to say, those commemorations, of the end of Nazi Germany, of German surrender, were opportunities to shake hands across ideological divides. Not so this year. We have celebrations in the West, in Britain, in France, in Germany, obviously, where explicitly Russian ambassadors, diplomats are not invited to. They are even sort of prohibited to attend. Even when I think last week, there were commemorations when in two former concentration camps that were liberated by the Red Army. And neither the Belarusian nor the Russian ambassador or diplomats were allowed to attend, let alone being invited. And that, I don't know, I mean, the Soviet Union at the time, I mean, their blood loss was monumental. 27 million people died, a quarter of the Belarusian population. And now, on the other hand, now we have celebrations. Actually, today, this is, we are recording this on 9th of May. And, on this 9th of May, today, we will have celebrations in Moscow, where, with the exception of the Slovakian President Fico, no Western European or NATO member country is attending. But we have, there are BRICS countries with their presidents, Brazil and South Africa, for instance. I think Cuba, Venezuela. There's also the president of Serbia. Lots of presidents, and so they're having their show there, and even the Chinese president. And funnily, I mean, this is really, I mean, the world is really upside down. We have now the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, of all people. He, yesterday or day before, he had an article in a Russian paper, because he's on a state visit to Russia, so he's trying to publish stuff, as sort of his entree. And in this paper, he said that, like, 80 years ago, the world stood together to defeat fascism and create a new world order. And most importantly, he singled out the creation of the UN, and on the UN, you have, and this is now the head of China's Communist Party. It's not President Trump. It's not it's not the Western. The head of the Chinese Communist Party. He writes, the more complex, now this is, I quote, the more complex the international situation becomes, the more important it is to protect and ensure the authority of the UN, to firmly uphold the UN-centric world order based on international law, the basic norms of international relations, based on the goals and principles of the UN Charter, to consistently promote the formation of an equal and orderly multipolar world, universally accessible and exclusive economic globalization. So now we have the head of the Chinese Communist Party tell us, actually what we originally wanted to do 80 years ago, and what we wanted to create. That's,
you wouldn't get a statement like that from the United States government right now, the country that was more behind the creation of the United Nations than any other,
Yeah, I think multipolar world order, that is, I think, not at all what the US would like.
Well, that's for sure. But I mean, as is evident so graphically throughout all of history, every empire ends sooner or later. And
Absolutely.
Whether you call it an empire or whether you see it as an empire, there's no doubt that there is currently one empire active in the world today, and another that is probably an aspirational empire. And certainly at Democracy Tomorrow, our hope is that people and leaders and people everywhere recognize that empire is not the way. Empire is simply one nation state or one type of people proclaiming its eternal greatness vis-a-vis all others, and should have the divine power to rule and things of that nature. And we very much are after a very different outcome than that. But what about just back to the AfD for a moment, because I mean
Yeah.
that's a really huge thing in Germany with all of its history and all of its historical baggage, which is still very much present. That a extreme right political party basically took all of former East Germany in the most recent elections. I mean, when you look at color-coded maps, you see that the
Yeah.
entire eastern part of the country, former East Germany, which I snuck into, by the way, during the communist time. For another day. Actually voted for an extreme right-wing party, and who happens to also have or seeks to have better and closer relations with your Russian friends, and also, of course, wants to reduce immigration into the country and all of the classical extreme right policies. And as you mentioned earlier, the current government made it quite clear that that the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, the extreme right wing party, has been classified essentially as a extremist party, and that creates all sorts of legal and other realities, which are not experienced by any of the other parties, of course. Essentially declaring that they are not in tune with the constitutional order of what Germany seeks to be based upon the basic law and all the other laws that govern the country. So how do you see that playing itself out? Because clearly, the CDU government, and it should be pointed out to listeners that, the previous government was Social Democrat Party plus Green Party plus the center Free Democratic Party. And the Green Party in Germany, which was established only in the late 70s, early 80s by Petra Kelly and Gert Bastian and all of those guys, never really dreaming of ever entering government, has entered government now, I think, 3 different times. And the most recent government, the foreign minister was Green Party. The minister of finance, I think, was Green Party. The Ministry of Climate Change or Environment was Green
Actually, it was
Party.
one,
Oh, they were
the
combined. That's
Minister
true.
of Economy was at the same time Minister of Climate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, but it shows both the positive thing that it is possible for a smaller party to become highly influential within the German proportional representation system. You have to get over 5% of the national vote in order to enter parliament. If you get 4.99%, as one of the parties did this last election, they didn't make it. And so that's a very interesting, rule that one must, achieve 5 or more percent to get in there. And
That's actually
clearly,
but by the way, that's one of the lessons from like the interwar period between
yes,
World War One and World War Two,
yeah,
the so-called
Weimar Republic.
Weimar Republic, where we didn't have, that 5% hurdle, and there were so many super small parties, that formed coalitions and fell apart, and which actually strengthened the extremists, on both sides. Actually,
Yeah.
it's a bit like the Israeli cabinet now. You have to make really strange deals and compromises to form a government.
Yeah, absolutely. But now, with the AfD got something in that, what was it, 24% of the national vote or something in that range?
Yeah,
Nearly a quarter of Germans voted for an
a
extreme
lot.
right-wing party.
Now they are at 30%.
30% even.
according
So
to the polls now. Yeah.
and so clearly the current government formulation is done in a strategic way to, actively exclude the inclusion of the AfD, as they have done in a number of other countries. But it's reaching a point where such approaches, as admirable as they may become effectively impossible if the AfD is allowed to grow more. And so I presume that the current anti-immigration policies are done, at least in part, as a way of deflating the wind that blows the sails of the AfD. And I'm sure they will do other right-leaning or close to extreme right-leaning policies in order to keep the AfD out of power. But it's almost an unimaginable thing. I mean, I've lived in Germany. I've spent so much time in Germany. So I've been to every corner of the country a million times, and the for a long period, I think it took about 30 years, 30, 40 years after the war for people to kind of relax a little bit because there was so much tension and anxiety and trauma associated with the war and coming to grips with the fact of what they did. But from the 80s onwards, and particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, I mean, Germany blossomed in ways I could have never imagined. And it became one of the most happy, kind of creative, alternative, uplifting, pretty friendly places that I'd ever seen. And to watch that evolution over the years was amazing. And I would always talk to people like, "Oh, you're going to Germany?" I said, "Yeah, because it's totally awesome. It's not like it used to be." And now it has the feeling, I hate to say it, but it has the feeling like sort of drifting backwards and sort of losing a lot of that really positive kind of forward-looking vibe that was so present in the last, 30-year period.
Well, I think there are a number of factors there. For one, it's easy to be nice when you're rich, but the economy is stuttering. There's lots of change happening. There's a lot of change economically, politically. Things that have been taken for granted are not granted anymore. The infrastructure is crumbling. People don't have the feeling that they are governed very well. That there's the feeling is there's too much bureaucracy, and there is an awful lot of bureaucracy because in a desire to make things better. Like you have a bureaucracy, and you have rules and laws, to make sure things are done according to certain principles. But then on the other, the backlash is that, then you have bureaucrats watching over it, and that takes an awful lot of time.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
you've mentioned former East Germany, the former Democratic Republic of Germany,
GDR. Yeah.
GDR, or Germany Democratic Republic, right?
Yeah.
And this rosy picture that you painted of Germany, especially there, many people didn't feel that way. They felt that their lives had been, I mean, of course they loved, that they could travel, they loved to have some hard currency in their pockets, but then again, they had the feeling that, their life was upended, and, their structures crumbled. You had
Totally.
cities that, they lost lots of inhabitants,
Yeah.
like maybe a third, whoever was young, able, and, he moved to the West to
Yeah.
because that's where the factories were, the jobs were, and where you could earn money and make yourself, a future, create your
Right.
own future. And
And it's hard,
so,
the part that I think a lot of people don't understand, particularly from the West, is that, there was like this presumption that, oh, suddenly they're free in 1989 and the wall has fallen and they can travel now and they can do anything and they're going to latch back on to the motherland of Germany and they're going to become wealthy and rosy and everything. But, in the process of that, and, that's kind of understandable as a point of view, but in what people never really paid attention to was the loss that the people there suffered. And many East Germans were truly deeply proud of their German democratic republic, the socialist system that they imposed there, and everybody got free housing, everybody got free medical care, everybody got free education, and it was real. I mean, I was, in Eastern Germany many times during the communist time, and it wasn't great, but at least the basics were covered, but I think also, just imagine one single civil servant, living in East Berlin and who's responsible for some particular government role, and then all of a sudden all of his life's work is completely
Yeah.
meaningless. All of the files he created and the articles he wrote and whatever he did is just thrown on the ground as if it never happened. Those 40 years didn't take place, you know? And you add that up to a society at large who are still really, at least in their perception, they feel like they're treated like second-class citizens. There's no doubt about it. And
Yeah,
yes, they may
absolutely.
have economically benefited. And I think how much, I mean, billions and billions of dollars were spent redeveloping the eastern part of Germany to make it, you know, at least sort of
Uh,
equivalent to Western Germany. And, you know, so, but nonetheless, it's still the poorest region. It suffered depopulation. Um, the people are longing for this kind of, you know, rosy past that never really existed at the way they're envisaging it, but they want something better, and they just don't see what democracy is giving them. And I think that's a fundamental issue, you know, that we cover on this channel, Democracy Tomorrow. Democracy, for it to work, it has to provide, you know, it has to serve the people and really perform and keep
exactly.
promises. And if it doesn't perform, if it doesn't, you know, if you promise 100,000 new housing units and you only come up with 3,000, well, you didn't perform. And you're going to create mistrust in the system and say, why should we believe in democracy when it's performing like that to us, you know? And I think that's the overarching sentiment, not just in Eastern Germany, but in all sorts of countries that are turning rightwards. Same with the United
Exactly.
States and a number of
And
others.
talking about Europe, you know, as we are doing now, I mean, the same is happening in other regions. I mean, we have Italy is a country that is run by a right-wing government, as is Hungary. And in Romania, as I mentioned earlier, you know, a right-wing candidate won the election, you know, on early May. There will be a second round, so we are not sure yet whether he is going to be president. But there's another right-wing government, and in France, you know, major center of Europe, there's the uh, Rassemblement National, uh, the far right party, having lots and lots of support, you know, and it's only that her front runner is now, by some kind of legal maneuvers, might be prohibited from running in the upcoming presidential elections. I think
Mhm.
it's next year or maybe after, you know, maybe 27. I'm not sure yet.
Well, and
But
don't forget your wonderful neighbors in Holland, you know, in the
oh yeah,
Netherlands, you
right.
know.
Absolutely.
Who would have ever thought
Absolutely.
that, you know?
So we have, you know, right-wing parties, you know, on the rise, you know, the liberal parties are on the retreat, and the new German government is reflecting that very much. People are fed up kind of with, like gender issues, in language. And as I said, this guy, there's a new cultural minister, Weimert, he would fit perfectly into the Trump administration, when it comes
Hmm.
to, how to deal with homosexuals, queers, and so on and so forth. He's really on par with them.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think it's not just a German phenomenon, but in Germany we're especially sensitive because, I mean, we had, Adolf Hitler, the fascist leader who brought upon the world World War II, and uh, millionfold murder of Jews. He was elected he was freely elected. It wasn't a putsch or something.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Yeah. And,
So
by the way, what do you think of this, a lot of people attribute the eventual loss of the Nazis to the very stupid decision of invading the Soviet Union, right? Their ally at the time, by the way,
yeah.
and they decided, well, Hitler decided, well, I think I'm going to go for that too because everywhere else was so easy. Let's go for that. And of course, that ended up being the beginning of the end for the Nazis. What do you think would have happened if he didn't invade the Soviet Union?
How should I know,
I
Scott?
don't
I
know,
have
but
I
I
have
mean,
no idea. Probably, he would have, probably he would have just held, sort of Western Europe, and it would have been way harder to overthrow him.
Yeah.
Actually,
I mean,
look
that's
at
what
the
I think.
countries. Look at the countries. In like France. That Germany conquered at the time. France or Belgium or Holland. There was some resistance, but all in all, people went on with their lives.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. But I mean, that one decision
but that but
fundamentally changed human history,
absolutely,
One
absolutely, and
guy
it
making one decision one day totally altered human history,
but
just as the Japanese decision to bomb Pearl Harbor did. People, particularly in the United States, they have no idea that the war was raging for 3+ years, and a
hmm,
lot of other stuff before that. And there was a massive movement within the United States to keep them out, very similar to the current America First approach. And
yeah,
had that bombing of Pearl Harbor not taken place, of course, there's no possible way that the Americans would have entered the war. So that again
yeah,
changed the history of the
absolutely,
planet. One
and
decision.
yeah, but I think it's I think that decision sort of grew on a fertile ground of hubris, and a total underestimation of the possibilities and the resources of the Soviet Union or Russia. It's the same mistakes that Napoleon made, and various times in history, Russia has been underestimated, and it's always a major mistake. You shouldn't do that. You
Yeah.
really
Well,
shouldn't.
I mean, every
It has
empire,
vast
like,
resources, and they're willing to spend it as and they don't count their dead, sort of.
well, they do, but
Well,
they still 80 years later are guided by the circumstances of World War II. I think much more than most other countries, because of the scale of the losses that they suffered, that most people are also not aware of. I mean, 27
I,
million people, it's
yeah,
probably even more. I've heard estimates up to like 35 million if you count
yeah.
starvation and other
It's
causes of death.
enormous.
I mean,
It's
it's
an enormous trauma.
unfathomable,
Yeah.
and it doesn't just go away. And when you
And and
combine
and
that,
and the and the Vladimir Putin's brother was killed, for instance. His
right?
he has personal loss, sort of,
Yeah. So,
from
and
those days.
those things linger on, and they can't just be shaken free. On the other hand, um, you know, perhaps they should have taken that more into account in the last few years, for some of their other military activities. But we can talk about Ukraine another day. But
Absolutely, yeah.
just before
That
we
that's
end,
that's really the defining issue of the moment, in a way. Yeah.
yeah,
Happy to
that's
talk
right.
another day. Yeah.
That's right.
We will
And
see. There's lots of movement there too. I think.
no, there really is. And
Yeah.
again, it plays into this entire issue of, the will and wish and vision of the people, broadly defined, and the will and wish and actions of individual leaders, most of whom are men, And, I continue to, as despite all of the horrible things I have physically seen in my life, which is far too many in all corners of the world, and that I know about by reading and talking to people,
Hmm.
etc. I still believe that a huge number of fellow human beings on the planet that we all share would deeply and quickly embrace a world that was not based on empires, not based on the superiority complexes of individual countries, but really just based on our shared humanity. And I've seen it time and time again all around the world, as have you. We know
Totally
between us
agree.
tens of thousands of people personally who would jump at the chance were it physically possible to have a global polity in which all of us participated as equals. And at the structural level, it would make sort of the bad decisions of the past by certain leaders almost impossible, because there wouldn't be the possibility to have a dictatorship, because there was no defined area of land that you had jurisdiction or control over, and you wouldn't have individual country military bases all around the world ready to fight. You'd have whatever we wanted to call it, the global government military bases would be around the world instead of US military bases
And
or Chinese military bases or whoever's military bases, and on the list goes. So I think it's just a reminder to again point out that as much as I would like to deny this fact and not allow this to actually be even contemplated as a reality, the reality is that individual people making individual decisions can fundamentally alter the shape of human history. And that has happened time and time again. And we need to get to a point where those decisions are not based on whatever lunacy they may have or whatever pathology they may have or whatever visions of grandeur they may have, but that are made truly in the interests of humanity as a whole. And we are talking about Europe today, but it's important to remember too, 60 to 70% of the world is effectively poor in 2025. These are people, the vast majority of the human race has never sat on an airplane. The vast majority of the human race does not have a bank account and certainly has no savings. The vast majority of humanity does not have security of tenure over the land or the home in which they live, and particularly slum dwellers. And the list goes on and on and on. So we're nowhere near reaching sort of a level of collective, economic and social development that, would satisfy all of the rights that people have under human rights treaties and things like that. And this current trend towards authoritarianism and increased nationalism and the greatness of our people versus the inferiority of those people, that's not going to get us anywhere, in the end. It might give you short-term satisfaction, but in the long run, it's not going to yield anything. So I hope that in the context of Germany, as we've been speaking about mostly today, and Europe more broadly, I mean, the European Union and what it stands for and the documents that have, underpin it are some of the most hopeful that exist in the world. And although there's tension and imperfections and things like that, the simple fact that most European countries are pretty peaceful right now, not really that interested in fighting with one another, in contrast to previous centuries, is a remarkable achievement, despite the problems of the current day.
I agree, especially, the funny thing is today, 75 years ago on this very day, May 9th, the French foreign minister at the time of the name Schuman, he promoted the sort of, it's called Montanunion, like the shared steel and coal industries,
Yeah.
the sharing of the steel and coal industries of Germany and France, which actually is the beginning, the first building stone of the European Union.
That's right.
And that was, because, this is remarkable for two reasons. Because one reason is Germany and France were shaking hands across, the divide of, the Second World War, and many wars before that. And France for German, for each other, Germany was for France and France was for Germany the arch enemy.
Yeah.
So they were able to shake hands on that. And the other thing was that steel and coal is what you need to produce weapons. That's the building stone of any military in the world.
Mm-hmm.
For cannons and guns and all, you need steel and coal. And so in order to avoid, getting, fully armed behind someone else's back, they decided, we're gonna create this together, these industries, in the rebuilding of Europe. And that was one of the founding stones of the European Union, which is remarkable, in which it is up to now really the only major institution in the world where states willingly give sovereignty to.
Right. Right. I mean, as we used to always say, I mean, I worked a lot in Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall, and particularly the wars in the Balkans, and what we used to always say is, all these countries that were fighting for independence at the time, Croatia and Serbia and, Kosovo and, all of them,
it's
Slovenia,
totally against the trend
etc.
of the time.
Yeah, and they were fighting for independence and demanding independence, and rightfully so. But what was the first thing they did once they got their independence, right? Begging on the door of Brussels, saying, "Please let us come in so we can renounce some of our own sovereignty and give it to you."
Yeah,
Right? So totally unexpected. So people, of course people complain about the EU and stuff, but that guy Schumann that made the like,
mm,
it's a visionary statement. We must merge our coal and steel communities together, and in merging it together we're mutually dependent on each other. How can we possibly fight each other, because then we'll be fighting ourselves? That is exactly the type of vision that we need today, in this world of increasing division and authoritarianism and things like that. We need to really focus on the commonalities and realize that we're so much stronger if we are merged together, as we already are. But we need to acknowledge that and embrace it, and see that we can actually go further as a species and evolve much more quickly when we see each other as ourselves. You know. So I think with that, I just want to make one more announcement regarding you, Matthias, before we wrap up today. Um, well, first of all, thank you so much for being our European correspondent, and we look forward to hearing from you on many different issues in the coming months and years. And also, Matthias has very kindly agreed to curate a multi-person discussion over a period of a week or two on the relationship between psychedelics, which is a very major issue now in the news in the last 5 to 10 years, and how psychedelics relate to politics generally, but particularly let's call it the erosion of boundaries within the
absolutely.
minds of those who have experienced psychedelics, and how can psychedelics, be transformed not just as in a psychological way necessarily, or just as a recreational way, but into a force for bringing people together more than they are now. And so Matthias will gather together 5, 10, 15 different people from the psychedelic movement, which is now global and huge and growing. And we'll try to get a bunch of different viewpoints on the relationship between politics, world citizenship, and psychedelics.
Yeah, that's a fascinating project, and I think a very important one too. There's hardly, I think, any other method to tear down hierarchies and to make really feel people connected and display the absurdity of fighting each other. Of course, conflict of interests will always be there, but if you can sort of discuss it out, on a much more fruitful basis if you understand the underlying sort of unity or oneness, if you want. Anyway,
Right.
very happy to go down that road. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, some of the I mean, there's so many interesting things happening in the psychedelic sphere, but a lot of scientific work is being done now that hasn't been done for decades. And, one of the absolutely clear findings by those who have, engaged with different types of psychedelics is this erosion of boundaries that may exist in the mind prior to taking the psychedelic compared to after, and this kind of, this sense of the commonality of all things, instead of the no man is an island sort of mentality. It's the no man is an island sort of mentality, and people realize that they are actually far more similar to everything around them than they may have a few hours before, and that can be utilized as a springboard to establishing different ways of doing politics in the end.
And also not just, when it comes to sort of hardcore politics, but also like the whole attitude towards the economy, towards the environment, towards extraction and extraction of resources and destruction of nature, because basically, you know, those substances can completely change your relation to all that in a very profound way, and probably very healthy way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, Matthias von Hein, thank you very much for today's discussion. And we look really forward to talking to you again in the coming days and weeks. Thanks,
Thank you
Matthias.
very much. Yeah, very happy.